Today we're going to be talking about Italian Renaissance art, and we were looking at Masaccio's tribute money. And we were talking about the fact that right around the same time that up north in the Low Countries, we see a move away from the International Gothic style, right? We also see a move away from the International Gothic style in Italy, and the interesting thing is how different they go about it, right? So up north, the move away from International Gothic was to enhance the level of detail. The level of realism became that much more sort of phenomenal. And that coincided with the beginnings of the use of oil paint, right? Or the more elaborate use of oil paint by Van Eyck, by Roger van der Weyden, by Robert Campin. In Italy, the approach is very different. The approach is not based on close observation and tight rendering of details. The approach is on logic and rationality, and a return to ancient Roman standards. But it's really about logic and rationality. And if you think about it, that's really the exact opposite of the interest in observation that we saw up north. One is sensory. One is using your eyes to look very, very closely, understand based on that. The other is using your mind to rationalize what you've observed. So whether it's using ancient Roman body types, which are all about rational proportions, sort of a system of perfected proportions of the human body, or whether it's using perspective, which is all about a sort of a rational, unified system for rendering space. Both of them reflect this Italian interest in the intellectual capacity of the artist to resolve logically the problems of art rather than optically, right? There's a big difference here in the approaches. So at the end of class, we were looking at Masaccio's tribute money, which we'll talk about next with the subject matter. We've already looked at the figure in red that's seen from two different points of view, the same figure, and based on ancient Roman sculptures, where he's in contrapposto pose, right? And at the end of class, we were talking about perspective, this new system of one-point perspective or linear perspective that was devised, rationalized by Brunelleschi, an architect, around 1415, 1420, and then published by his colleague in Florence, Leon Battista Alberti, around 1435. In the early years, those first 15 years between the first sort of understanding of perspective and its final publication, the only people that seem to have known about it were friends of Brunelleschi. It seems to have traveled by word of mouth, right? So the artists that are actually using it are artists that are sort of part of this circle. And given the way in which society was set up, this is easier than it would be today, because all of our painters, right, all of our artists would have belonged to a craft guild, where they would have seen each other regularly. Right? Think of a modern analogy would be a trade union, right, like the Teamsters or something, right, or Electricians Local 101. Right? The painters belong to a guild, right? And that guild would have brought them into contact with each other quite frequently. So the idea of sharing ideas, it should not surprise us at all. Right? Now, when it comes to using perspective, we mentioned at the end of class that Masaccio is rather crafty about this. And you can choose your vanishing point, which in this diagram, this is actual diagram from Alberti's treatise on painting called De Peinture from 1435. The vanishing point is C on the diagram, and you can put it anywhere on the canvas, right? It doesn't have to be in the middle. So, for example, with Van Eyck's Annunciation in the National Gallery, it sort of seems as if it's off to the right, right? It orients how you look at the picture and where you sort of visually start to move your eyes. And what Masaccio does is he puts it right at Christ's head, so that when we look at the image, we are psychologically directed to look at Jesus, which kind of makes sense, right? And then if you look at the way the composition is organized, which we'll see in just a second. Well, here, let's use our next slide, right? If you look at the way the composition is organized, you'll notice that the figures of the apostles appear in this sort of wheel around Christ as if he's the hub. And just like sitcoms, it opens up on our side so we can see it clearly. There's nobody really blocking the scene, right? So the perspective plus the organization helps us to focus on Christ. I love the fact that this is the first time we've seen it in this class at least. The perspective also, the halos are in perspective. Think back to Giotto, the halos were always as if they were on the surface, right? They were perfectly round and sort of violated the sense of 3 dimensions. They sat on the surface of the panel, right? They looked at us this way. And now they've been tacked to the back of their foreheads or something. They're wearing them like stylish gold hats, on the backs of their heads. And everywhere we look, depending on how they're moving their head, the halos are in perspective, right? So it governs everything. Even the supernatural things seem to be governed by this sense of perspective. Now the subject matter here, the tribute money, is a scene from the life of St. Peter, which you remember from the worksheets was the theme of this group of paintings, the life of St. Peter. And this is where a tax collector comes to the apostles as they are gathered on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And the tax collector says it's time to pay up your taxes, April 15th, right? And Peter mouths off and he says, we don't owe anything to the state. We follow Jesus. Peter and Christ says, shut up, right? This happens with Peter a lot. He's a hothead and Christ is always sort of shutting him down and saying, hang on a second, there's an answer here, right? And so here is our tax collector with his back to us, and he's got his hand out, right? Reaching to Jesus saying, it's time to pay the money, right? And Peter has already sort of cracked off saying, we don't owe anything. And Christ says, be quiet, go over there to the Sea of Galilee and reach into the water and you'll find a fish, right? So we have this series of gestures, and what Masaccio is doing is telling the story in human terms, even though it's a miracle, right? It's really about the dialogue between people. So this figure turns to Christ. We can see some of the apostles looking at him kind of warily, maybe conversing with each other about what's going on. And Christ is gesturing to St. Peter, saying, go over there to the Sea of Galilee. And Peter's going, you mean over there to the Sea of Galilee? Right? And you can see that he follows Christ, if you will, by following his gesture, by echoing his gesture. Right? So Peter in orange and blue. I don't know why he's in orange and blue, but this becomes a really strong tradition in art history. We almost always see him in that same color scheme, and I don't know why, like where it came from, how it got established. But it seems to be pretty consistent. So Peter's with the trimmed beard, right? Not the one with the Kovacs behind him, with the blue and orange. And Christ is saying, go to the Sea of Galilee. He says, you mean over here, right? And their gestures show us a second image of St. Peter, right? So time elapses within the picture, just like with Duccio, where we saw Jesus twice, right? So the picture is going to tell us the story. And so he says, over there, go find a fish. And there he is, and he's reaching in the mouth of the fish, right? And you can see this is a really complicated pose, and Masaccio is not quite up to this task, right? He doesn't have a good piece of Roman sculpture to go on for this. And kneeling down, he's working on it, bending over his knees, but it's still a little on the awkward side. But still, I love the fact that he's got that fish there, and he's caught him by the gills almost, right? And he's going to reach in his mouth. And if you know the story, what does he find there? Does anybody know this? When he goes over to the fish, the Bible story, he finds a coin in the and Jesus tells him, go to the fish, open his mouth, you'll find a coin. And he goes, this is crazy, but I'll do it, okay? And he goes over there and he finds the coin, he brings it out, and he takes it back to Jesus. And Jesus says, tell me, whose face is on the coin? And Peter says, well, it's the face of Caesar. And Christ says, well then, render unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. Right? So the coin's got his face on it, give it back to him. The miracle pays the taxes. So on the far right, we see the conclusion of the story. There he's giving the miraculous coin that he found in the mouth of the fish back to the tax collector. Right? This is all in, I think, Matthew 27, right, is where the story is told. But what Masaccio does, right, in elaborating, he uses three different human interactions, well, two different human interactions, and then the miracle is kind of put off in the background. Because what he's focusing on is the humanity of the scene. Human interchange. And this is, as you know from your worksheets, this is the era of humanism, Renaissance humanism, right? The importance of our actions and our roles as part of a community, right? In addition to how that relates to our Christian faith, if we were 15th century Italians, right? So Masaccio is telling the story, and he's telling it in human terms, something that was born with Giotto and continues as we move here into the 15th century. Now, this is another fresco. Most of our paintings that are on walls of churches are done in fresco. Every now and then we'll have a panel that's engaged to the building, but on the norm, they're working in fresco. And you remember from before what the fresco process is, right? Wet plaster with watercolor painted into it while it's wet, adhering to the wall, forming a bond with the plaster, and then finished with other paint to give you the more sort of sharper details, right? Painted dry at the very end, right? But fresco simply means fresh. And here in this particular chapel, there are numerous scenes from the life of St. Peter, and you can see down below on the right, same costume, different scene, right? And we can follow it around. In fact, when the wall makes a 90 degrees, you can pick out Peter over there as well. Right? They're very good about storytelling by making sure that they don't confuse us. Right? Film directors talk about this, right? You watch a movie, and if they're going to be a chase scene, they're always going to be going in the same direction. They're never going to come back the other way because it'll confuse you visually, right? And if you've got characters that you want to stand out, you dress them the same way in the first 2 or 3 scenes, and then you know who they are. Or you cast Brad Pitt, right? And then you know who they are. Right? They see him in the background. Oh, that's going to show up somewhere, right? Well, our painters are doing kind of the same thing by using repeated costuming and settings in order to sort of elaborate the story. This particular chapel was funded by the Brancacci family. And this was the norm in Italy and up north, was for families to fund chapels within churches. And usually the case was that the more money you gave, the closer the chapel was to the high altar, right? So up north we saw, for example, Jos Weid and the Ghent altarpiece, right? He gave the money for the chapel, gave the money for the altarpiece. That was his family's primary place for prayer, but other people could use it as well, right? It wasn't isolated and off view. These were semi-public, if you will. And so the Brancacci family funded this particular suite of frescoes by Masaccio and a second painter named Masolino, right? And the Brancacci family was decorating this chapel in honor of the family patriarch who had recently deceased. And they were using the money from his dowry to offset the cost of the frescoes. And lo and behold, his name, the deceased patriarch, was Pietro. And this then accounts for the choice of subject matter in the building. St. Peter, the namesake of the patriarch of the family. And that's something we see a lot in the history of art, where subject matter is chosen based on some sort of personal resonance. So think of Roger van der Weyden with that deposition altar we saw, right? That choice was based on the preferences of the patron. In that case, a group patron, right? We think the same is true for Roger's little St. George and the Dragon. Someone with a connection to a military guild, right? Dedicated to St. George, or maybe somebody named George, right? But there's almost always, when the patron makes the decision, there's some personal resonance or reference for why that particular saint was chosen, right? So with Masaccio, we're seeing the early Renaissance really get going. This interest in humanity, this interest in Roman body types that add to the humanity, these perfect athletic specimens from ancient Roman sculpture, and interest in perspective that gives it a unified space. And we'll see these things continue as we look at other works of art from 15th century Italy, primarily Florence is what we're going to look at. So from the same time period, shortly after Masaccio, is Fra Angelico. Also very much interested in, as you can probably tell, in linear perspective. Here we see the Annunciation set in this portico, this nice little Italian porch. I'd like that in my backyard, right? With a fenced garden protecting it from the wilds outside. And the angel comes in, just as he always does, from the left, taking a knee, the Virgin leaning forward in response. She's not reading now. We don't have all those details that we got used to seeing in northern pictures, because that's not the way the Italians work. Right? They're interested in logical space. That doesn't mean they are not interested in symbolism. It's just kind of handled in a very different way. So in this case, right, we can look at the perspective, and lo and behold, the perspective, again, is chosen. Right? Where do you put the vanishing point? Because that can make a difference in how the audience perceives the picture. And in this case, look where it is. It's that window in the room in the background. Why do you think he put it there? He could have put it anywhere. Do you think he might have had a reason for that? Putting the vanishing point at the window, directing your eye to that window in the back? Sorry? Why not make Mary the focal point? Exactly right. Why make it the window? Well, what have we talked about windows before? What's the importance of the window?
God's voice is always coming through the window, and it's the symbolism of light coming through.
Excellent. So we've seen in almost every Annunciation the idea of the light of God coming down to the Virgin Mary, right? As a focal part of the Annunciation. And at first it was rather simplified, God just up in the sky, right, in the background. But then later we saw, for example, with Van Eyck and with Robert Campan, the idea of the light coming through a window as the dove descends toward the Virgin Mary. And here that doesn't happen in the same way, but what Fra Angelico does is to use it to point to a window where we see light coming through. Going back to that exact same reference of the idea that if light can pass through glass when it's pure, without breaking the glass, then the light of God can pass into the Virgin Mary, because she is, as they referred to in devotional literature, the vessel most pure. Right? So that makes an analogy. It's a symbolic reference, right? And with that in mind, we'll notice that even though there's not a lot of little symbolic details here, one wonders whether that room, that clean, well-swept, empty room, might itself also just be a metaphor for the Virgin. Right? She is the empty chamber. She is the clean and pure chamber, like the room in the background. Another analogy that was used for the Virgin Mary is to refer to her as an enclosed garden. Right? And we find this in devotional literature all the time. Mary, the enclosed garden. Beauty inside, walled off from the wilds outside. And Fra Angelico gives us also a very strong reference to that idea too, by giving us this picket fence in the background that encloses flowers in the garden and keeps them away from the wilds outside. Right? So even though it doesn't include as many details as a Robert Campan picture, as a Jan van Eyck, it too gives us references to the theological meaning, the symbolism of the Annunciation. Now, Fra Angelico, the name Fra means brother. Think fraternity, right? Okay. Fra simply means brother. Fra Angelico was a monk, a Dominican monk, a member of the Dominican order, right? So he had taken his vows. He was actually named Fra Giovanni. But he got the nickname of Fra Angelico because his figures are so porcelain-like and angelic looking that the nickname kind of stuck for Fra Angelico. But it's a much later nickname. His colleagues would have called him Fra Giovanni. Right? And he belongs to, or is a member of, the monastery of San Marco in Florence. Now remember, the Dominicans were one of our two mendicant orders, right? Remember the mendicants, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. What made them different from other monastic orders? Remember this? They lived in the city, right? And because they lived in the city, they didn't have enough room to sort of be self-sufficient, so they were forced to rely on gifts, right? And mendicant means begging, right? They would actually ask for alms to support the monastery, right? So this is a new monastery, had just been built in San Marco, or in Florence, as the Dominicans moved closer to the center of town, right? And Fra Angelico is one of them. He decorates the entire monastery with frescoes, right? So our fresco here on the right actually greets you as you move your way toward the places where the individual monks lived, and each in their individual cells. And you'd have to go to a sort of upstairs, away from the street, and you come to the top of the stairs and you see this. And then you turn and you look and you end up here. And you'll notice that the architecture that Fra Angelico puts in the Annunciation is the architecture we see here. Right? So for the brethren at the Dominican monastery at San Marco, it almost looks like the Annunciation is happening in their space. Right? And that's, again, similar to what we saw with Van Eyck and Campan, right? Outside the windows of the Annunciation, we saw modern cities that look like the Low Countries. In this case, it happens in a room that looks very much like the room where Fra Angelico and his brethren at the Dominican monastery lived. Right? By the way, the architecture is by one of the pupils of Brunelleschi. Right? It's a modern building. In addition to the frescoes, Fra Angelico also painted the high altar. There's a chapel at the monastery, and who better than him to paint the altarpiece that decorated the chapel that was used by the monks at San Marco. And the San Marco altarpiece depicts, well, first, saints sort of surrounding the Virgin, and you can see the background looks kind of similar to the background in our Annunciation scene here. You can see trees against the sort of evening sky, right? And a group of saints arranged symmetrically around the Virgin and Child against that cloth and in that niche, right? On the right are three Dominican saints, the founders of the Dominican order, and they always dressed in black and white. So the altarpiece is specialized, if you will, for the people who were viewing it. They might hope as they looked at this that they too would one day be welcomed at the foot of the Virgin's throne in heaven, just as the founders of the order are. Directly in the front of this are two kneeling saints who have a place of prominence on either side of the Virgin Mary. One of them looks directly out to us. The other one looks in toward her. When Alberti wrote that manual on how to paint, right, when he gave us the perspective scheme, one of the things he told us as well, you as a painter, right, is a good way to get people engaged with the scene is to put people on either side, one of them looking out and one of them looking in. And that way you get welcomed in. It's like, hey, right? And take a look up here. And that's exactly what Fra Angelico is doing here, right? One looks out at us, one looks in, helping to introduce us to the picture as viewers. These two saints are Saints Cosmas and Damian. St. Cosmas on the left, and you can see if you look at his halo, there's his name, Cosmas. Right? Damiano has his back to us. Cosmas and Damian were two brothers from around the 4th century who were doctors. And they were miraculously given the ability to heal without using medicine, just by touch and by their faith in God. And they vowed to never take payment for healing because it wasn't them doing it, right? It was God, right? So they should just do it for free. Sounds like Canada. The state would pay for it rather than our system, right? So there they are, these two doctor saints in the foreground. We have to ask ourselves, why are they given the place of prominence like this? What's the connection between Cosmas and Damian and the monastery of San Marco? And the connection is the people who paid for this. Now, while this was in the monastery, the money for the land that the new monastery was built on, for the building itself, and for all of the decorations was given by the Medici family, the very, very powerful Medici family. In particular, Cosimo de' Medici, the leader of them. Now, the Medici family were bankers. They had gotten Palestrozzi, who we looked at last class, gotten him kicked out of town. That altarpiece we saw, the Strozzi altarpiece, took it for themselves. Right? Put it in one of the chapels. Right? Cosimo was the head of the family at this point, right? 30s through 1460 or so, right? For a better part of 30 years, the head of the family. And the Medici family are basically running Florence. Now, Florence is a democracy, right? Well, it's actually, what do you call it? Plutocracy. But still, you had to belong to one of the guilds to get elected to office. And then you had to belong to one of the most prominent families to get elected to office. But they did have term limits, right? And they did have sort of representative government. And the Medici were really smart. Cosimo was really crafty with this. He never, ever got elected to city office himself. He just got his people elected, who would do what he told them to behind the scenes. And during the entire lifetime of Cosimo, from 1430 or so, when he comes of age, to 1460, dies in 64. And then with his son and his grandson, all the way through the 15th century, they are ruling Florence. Right? Up until the point when his grandson gets kicked out in 1492. Right? Maybe 94. Okay? So he's governing, and he's giving the money to the monks at San Marco to rebuild their cathedral, or their monastery. Right? He buys them the land, he funds the building. The architect is his personal architect, right? Had built his palace. Right? And as you might guess, that helps Cosimo Cosmas, right? It's his namesake. And Medici, medicine. The Medici family were bankers, but they had been, earlier in the Middle Ages, doctors, physicians. So Cosmas and Damian are actually the patron saints of the family, if you will. They look to them as their great exemplars from medieval history because they had their basis in medicine. Their name means medicine, right? So Cosimo is named after Cosmas. His younger brother, Damiano, is named after Damian, and he had just died. And that might account for why his back is to us as well. Right? Because he's departed. Where Cosimo's still alive. Right? That's a portrait of Cosimo as well. That's his face on the face of St. Cosmas. Right? So, when we look at the altarpiece painted for this monastery by Fra Angelico, it's important to remember who paid for it, and that accounts for why we see what we see. Right? Not only does the painter, being a monk there, have something to do with this, but Cosimo de' Medici money, has something to do with the choices that Fra Angelico makes. Now, up north, altarpieces are just like triptychs, right? We like hinging things that folded. So the secondary scenes were often on the sides. In Italy, think back to Giotto and Duccio, The secondary scenes are often along the bottom in a predella, right? And that was the case with the San Marco altarpiece as well. There were actually paintings on the sides here. It stuck out from the wall like this, and there are paintings down the sides here, looking this way, and across the bottom, right? In the predella. And that was cut up like so many paintings, and each of them sold off to different collections, right? The high altar is in the Uffizi in still in Florence today, right? But the very first scene in the predella, down in the National Gallery, right? So a very important picture, even though it's fairly small, right? And it tells us, as predellas often do, right? What does the predella show us? Narrative scenes of the people in the main altar, right? And remember from one of the earlier worksheets, it was usually a Virgin or Jesus, like what we saw with the Nativity by Duccio, right? But sometimes they're lives of the saints, and that's the case here. We have 8 different scenes from the life of Saints Cosmas and Damian, going back to why do we venerate them. And I wish I had time to go through it. This is a great story. It's really funny, actually. But this is the very first scene. We don't see how they got their superpowers. It's not like the, Black Panther's opening on Friday, right? And so you think about, oh, well, what's the origin story? And every time they reboot Spider-Man, you got to see him get bit by a radioactive spider again, right? So they always want to, give us. We don't get the origin story. We just get them. Okay, they can heal, right? It's a given, right? So it's like when I was 18, I saw Steve Martin back in Portland perform, and he had one of his great jokes was how to get $1 million and not pay taxes. And he said, first get $1 million, right? Then, and it's the same thing here. So how do you heal miraculously? Well, first heal miraculously, and then here we are, right? So Palladia is in bed and she's sick and she's gone to everybody, right? Absolutely everybody looking for help, right? And none of the standard traditional doctors can heal her. And she's like spent all of her money trying to, not all of it, but a lot of her money trying to get healed. So she decides finally a little alternative health care, right? She goes to Cosmas and Damian. She's heard about their powers. And so we see in the inside, there they are, and they're bringing her, and they're going to heal her, right? And there's no doubt about it because they've got halos. And you notice that Fra Angelico has old school halos, right? Unlike Masaccio's high fans, right? They're actually flat on the surface. And so Palladia with their servants are going, ooh, really? Are they going to be able to do this? And they're going to, administer to her, right? Notice around the bed that perspective is still being used, right? That the space is being defined by one-point perspective, and there's some really wonderful details. I love that dish on the shelf that I imagine, what is that? I think that's Damian is kneeling on, right? With that wonderful silver dish next to it. Right? So 2 scenes, right? So they're giving Palladia healing, and remember that they've taken this vow, right, to never ever take money for this because they're doing God's work, right? Second scene outside, she's healed now. There's Palladia a second time, right? Now in purple, and she's insisting to Damian, you've got to take money. You've got to let me give you something. He keeps saying, no, 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 yes, yes, yes. And he finally decides it would be rude if he didn't. You know how that is sometimes when people want to give you a gift and you don't really want the fruitcake at Christmas. You take it anyway because it's rude to say no, right? And Damian says it's rude to say no, right? And finally takes it. It pisses Cosimo off to no end. He refuses to have anything to do with his brother from that point forward because the brother took money against their solemn oath. He says, when we die, I don't even want to be buried next to you. He's so upset, right? And this is where the story gets kind of funny because they get martyred and they try to martyr them, and each of the scenes shows them trying to be martyred, right? And they try everything. They push them off a cliff and the ocean spits them back out. They put them up on crosses, they shoot arrows out and they bounce off and they kill the archers, Finally they cut off their heads, right? But in the midst of all of this, and this is where it's funny, a camel tells Cosmas that, right? A camel tells Cosmas, look, what Damien did was honorable, right? He was doing it out of respect to the woman. He wasn't doing it for profit. And you should forgive him. And Cosmo says, okay, right? And so when they're finally beheaded, they're buried together, and everything ends nicely, right? Unless you want to keep your head, right? So that's told off all the way through the rest of these, right? It is how that all takes. We see the first scene in the story here. And so, again, this would have been really important for Cosimo de' Medici, right? Because if you think about Cosimo de' Medici, where he is in 1435, mid-30s, he's a banker, right? How do bankers make money? Interest, right? Interest on loans. That's a sin, right? That got Scrovegni's dad so infamous that he's in Dante's Inferno, right? That's usury. That was seen as a sin. So the idea of taking money for service, even though it's medical service, right, would have been really attractive to Cosimo de' Medici to lead off the scene. At the same time, consistent with the legend of Cosmus and Damien. Right? Should have had this up there. I've got some nice details, right, of them. And again, this is relatively small. It's you see the crack allows us to see it, and they're administering to her as the servants look on. A nice metal dish with reflections on it, and then here's our detail of her saying to Damien, please take a gift, and he's saying, no, I really can't, I really shouldn't, I made a promise. And I love just the human gestures, the way in which our Italian Renaissance artists tell stories in human fashion, through gesture, through facial expressions, right? So, Fra Angelico is one of two painters we have, actually there's more, but two painters that we'll look at, that belong to religious orders, right? It's not uncommon for painters to actually be monks as well. And in fact, that's the medieval tradition, that many of our artists in the Middle Ages were in fact monks. It's really only in the Renaissance era, this 1300s on, that we begin to get the idea of professional artists outside of the monastery. Down at the National Gallery, we have a second, as you can tell from his name, a second artist who's a monk, Fra Filippo Lippi. Right? Also worked for Cosimo de' Medici. The Medici family were huge patrons of the arts. And they didn't throw all of their money at just one artist, but rather hired numerous artists over the many generations to work for them. Right? Filippo Lippi also works for the Medici. This painting, however, was probably not made for them. We don't know if we can't say it wasn't, but there's no proof that it was. Right? Made instead sort of for the open market. Now, Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi present a study in contrasts. Both of them are monks. Okay, that starts off our comparison. Fra Angelico, very devout, an honored member of the monastery of San Marco in Florence. Right? Lifelong adherent to the tenets of monasticism. Filippo Lippi was a party animal, apparently. Remember we've mentioned before this biographer named Vasari, V-A-S-A-R-I. Giorgio Vasari writes the lives of the artists in the 1560s, how Renaissance art developed. He tells us about Filippo Lippi, about the biography of, and it's a great story, right? When he was working for Cosimo de' Medici, he was so prone to going out drinking that Cosimo de' Medici had to lock him up inside the studio to get him to finish his paintings, otherwise he would never complete them, Vasari tells us, right? Vasari also tells us that at one point Filippo Lippi left Florence and went up north to, not way north, but northern Italy, to paint frescoes in a convent full of nuns. And guess what happens? He knocks one of them up, right? Gets one of the nuns pregnant. She runs off with him. Her name is Lucretia Buti. You don't have to bother with that. Buti, though, is B-U-T-I. Lucretia, I never thought before, Lucretia Buti. And Vasari tells us not only they went off together, but she posed for many of his Madonnas. That's later than this, so this isn't her. But even, and at that point, right, he got kicked out of the monastery. Because, I mean, really, right? Vasari also tells us he was twice arrested for embezzlement. You know, so he's not like the most upstanding person. And he eventually gets kicked out of the monastery. But what's interesting is he continues to sign his pictures Fra Filippo Lippi, right? He's sort of proud of that background, even after he's been defrocked, right? Been kicked out of the monastery. So this is before all the troubles happen, right? Here he's still a monk at this point. And it gives us this small devotional image of the Virgin and Child, right? It's not that small. It's about like this, 2.5, 3 feet tall, but made for either a chapel or for use at home. And there were quite a few images of the Virgin and Child being produced in Florence. There was a huge market for these among the new money, right? We talked about the point of money in the Renaissance, how important this new money was, right? And Filippo Lippi seems to have been cranking out quite a few of these that are really similar to each other, right? And he might have had sort of one that he showed, and the people say, I want this, but I want you to do this, that, and the other thing with it, because that's what I want for my use, right? Or he may have had a whole range of them in stock that he's selling. I can get the standing baby that emphasizes the fact that he's fully human, right? By showing his little naughty bits, right? Or I want something that is different, where Christ sits on the altar. You can make that choice, right? So think about it as going to a good analogy. I think of lots of bad analogies. The tire store, and you want these tires versus these ones for your car, right? But they're all tires, and they're all going to work, right? And each one is one is good for snow, and one is good for dry, and one is good if you really want to drive fast, and the other one is if you're more conservative, right? Same thing with the Madonna and Child. Each one would sort of meet different purposes. Julia.
Is this just the first time we're seeing it, or is it the first time it's happening that Madonna and Child are blonde?
Ooh, good question. You're assuming that I can immediately recall every picture ever made.
Well, it's just a stark contrast.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The blonde Madonna, and I don't have an answer for it. I'll tell you what it is. The answer is, if your question was, is this the first time ever, or the first time we're seeing it? It's the first time we're seeing it, right? I can tell you that much. When it started, I can't tell you. But it leads me to sort of an interesting. One of my graduate advisor, Colin Eisler, said one time. I remember this like clear as day. He said, maybe, possibly, perhaps are the most important words to the art historian. He said, we're almost always wrong when we pronounce on things, right? Black and white, firsts, right? We're almost always wrong. We're almost always wrong, except when we think we're absolutely right, and then we're certainly wrong, right? So firsts are always difficult, right? Greatest and firsts and biggest and things like that, right? They're hard to say. And I don't know if it's consistent, right, at this point. Now that you've got me thinking about it, I'm going to be looking at our other Madonnas and saying whether or not that's the case. If they're getting that way, and how we might begin to explain it. Okay? Now, you notice in both of these, the clothing is different, the posture of Christ is different, but the setting is really similar. Each of them, she's in front of this niche, and you'll notice that the half dome of the niche looks like a seashell, like a conch shell, right? Scallop shell, yeah? And that's a fairly common architectural decoration, not only in Renaissance Italy, but also in ancient Roman architecture, because architects are also looking back and reviving things that they've seen before, right? So that's certainly common enough to not need much more explanation. But in both of these, and by the way, it was behind the San Marco altarpiece as well, was another scallop shell. It makes reference directly to Venus, who, according to legend, was born on a scallop shell and blown to shore. You've seen this before, right? One of the most famous images in Western art is the bird. This is Oil of Olay uses this, right, for soap advertisements. It was Uma Thurman in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen back in the 90s played Venus from this. You'll find it, right? Movie trivia. The connection being made here isn't meant to be blasphemous at all, but rather philosophers, theologians in the 15th century saw a great many connections between ancient Roman, non-Christian, pagan religion and Christianity. They saw mirrors there, analogies. And this group, which are called Neoplatonists, Neoplatonism, is drawing these connections and saying, just as Venus is the goddess of love, so Mary brings love to the world. Right? And so the conch shell behind her head makes a visual analogy to remind us that Mary is to Christians analogous to Venus to the ancient Romans. It's part of this Renaissance revival within a Christian context. Right? And as we look at Mary closer, you can see that on the front of her, what would you call that? Hat? Do-rag? Right? There's a pearl right on the front of it as well. And in fact, in many ways, it's like her head's the pearl. You know? The jewel inside the conch shell. Even though it's not an oyster shell per se. Right? So Philippa Lippi is making reference to her as being similar to Venus. And that's not uncommon in the 15th century. That's actually rather fluent in examples coming from Neoplatonic writings. Right? That she is the Christian analogy to the Virgin Mary. If we look down at little Jesus, we see that he's pulling her finger again. That cute little child, baby and mother connection that we saw going back to Giotto, right? Just meant to be sort of cute and show that they have a human connection, right? The humanity of the scene. It's also interesting that he's pulling on ostensibly her ring finger, right? Drawing a connection to a ring finger. And some people suggest that this might actually be a reference to the fact that in Catholic theology, Christian theology, Mary is the church. Okay? All the churches that are in Notre Dame. And we saw with Van Eyck, right? There she is, the Annunciation, she's oversized, she is the church. Right? The church is her. Right? But in heaven, the church is called the bride of Christ. Right? The theological bride of Christ. So by playing with her ring finger, the infant Jesus is making reference to this theological concept of their relationship on earth being mother and child, but in heaven being symbolically Christ wed to the church. Right? So it's not just haphazard how he's going about it. It's actually very deliberate in what Jesus is doing. Playing with her ring finger, alluding to the fact that in heaven she's the bride of Christ, the church. Now, what's she doing with her hand? Look in the detail. She's got it like on his chest, right? Kind of protecting him, but look at where her thumb and her forefinger are. Okay? Right here, right? Like I'm pinching his neck. What's between her thumb and her forefinger? On a guy that's not there on a girl? The Adam's apple, right? She's actually touching his Adam's apple. It's almost like she's pinching at it. Well, again, theologically, in the Renaissance, Christ was referred to as the new Adam. Both of them came from the direct intervention of God to the earth, miraculously born. Adam brought sin, Christ brings salvation. So if we think about these ideas that are prominent, well known at the time, one, the virgin, the bride of Christ in heaven. to Christ is the new Adam. The Virgin Mary is often called the new Eve as well. Right? We talked about that with the flower in John. How the flower grows from the stem of Eve, right? The thorns lead to soft fragrance, right? Mary's the new Eve. Christ is the new Adam. And Filippo Lippi makes reference to this by having her literally direct her attention to his Adam's apple. Okay? Now, this is, I don't know how well, in medieval Christianity, this is a great story. There was this idea that the Adam's apple came from the fact that when he took the apple, it stuck in his throat. And that's why men have it, right? And I could show you these stained glass windows at Chartres Cathedral from the 12th century, 13th century, where we see Adam and Eve going through all the steps in heaven, and then as he eats the apple, he goes like this, right? And which is, of course, he's realizing the sin, but it's also sticking in his throat, which was used to account for why men got this thing and women don't, right? Was that it was the apple of the original sin that Adam had eaten. That's like, now Eve ate it too, so go figure. But it stuck with Adam, and there we are. She's pointing to it here. Right. Did I hear somebody asking a question? No. Just reacting to this medieval silliness. Filippo Lippi, like most of our artists, ran a shop. And the way that artists trained, as we saw up north with Robert Campin and Roger van der Weyden, the way that artists trained was you would apprentice under a master artist when you were in your early teens, right? And then at a certain point, usually fairly young, you would branch out on your own. Okay. That usually required a major cash investment. You had to set up your own studio, you had to develop your own clientele. It was a risk. And we find many artists would stay pupils for a long time after their official apprenticeship. Sandro Botticelli apprenticed under Filippo Lippi. Right? And our picture shows again the conch shell in the background. We can also notice with both of these pictures the degree to which perspective is playing a role. Subtle in Filippo Lippi, but there is in fact these parallel lines that do converge, and how Botticelli constructs this, is it another enclosed garden? We see the wall behind her, opening to either side, right? But all very tightly constructed in perspective. Right? And the same conch shell that we see in Filippo Lippi's work. That's not a sign that he apprenticed under him by any means. It was common as a theme in the 15th century. That same reference to the Virgin Mary as Venus, right? That analogy. This is what tips us off. Here's a Filippo Lippi that seems to have been the basis for Botticelli's work. Both painted around the same time. Filippo Lippi puts them in front of a window that leads to this landscape in the background, whereas Botticelli closes it off. Right? And you can see how similar the two of them are in conception. This is the young Botticelli. In 1460, he would have been 15 years old. Right? So he's somewhere in his teens when he painted this. He's pretty good, right? It always blows me away, that precociousness of young Renaissance artists, right? But using his master's example for a different work of art for the open market, right? Right down to the throne in the corner, right, that he's modeled on. And even I love this. This is so cute because they're lifting him up to the Virgin Mary. This is probably the nun, by the way. That's probably Lucretia Butti there. This is a later work after he'd had that problem with, again, the pearl on her head that we saw in our picture as well. And all of these things sort of translated over into the Botticelli work on the right. So very early work by Botticelli, who was a Lippi pupil. And like I said, he's somewhere between 15 and 20 years old. Some people think this is a self-portrait, that the angel looking directly out at us is indeed a portrait of Botticelli himself. And somebody with those same features, albeit 5 years older, 10 years older, appears in other works by Botticelli, right? And that's what makes us think we have no proof that this might be a self-portrait of the painter as well. Right? I do like how he engages with us. He looks out toward us, again, sort of following those instructions from Alberti on how to make a painting engaging. Now, this one was actually made for the Medici family. We don't know who Filippo Lippi's picture was made for. Open market, it could have been made for anybody, but there are clues in this one that this was actually a Medici picture. And we'll find that Botticelli works with the Medici quite a bit. He's one of their favorite painters in the 15th century. Right? Makes portraits for them. That Birth of Venus that we saw, that's a Medici picture. Right? And this one we know was made for the Medici family because in the lower left corner, on the throne, are these is this circle with the 6 gold balls, right? They call them torteaux. Don't have to bother with that, right? That's the Medici symbol, right? And it actually helps us to date it because they eventually got another one added to it. And this is before the other one was added, so this is how we know it was early, right? But that is a direct reference to the Medici family. So this is a work of art that would have been commissioned by them. At this point in the Medici legacy, it may have been Cosimo, depending on how early it was painted. Cosimo dies in 1464. This is a posthumous medallion. It's about like this, right? About almost a foot across. Almost the size of an old LP, right? With Cosimo in portrait, in profile portrait on one side, some other things on the back. It may have been commissioned by him, may have been by his son named Piero, right? Could have commissioned it, but it certainly was for the Medici family. And this sets the stage for where we're going to spend most of the rest of the 15th century, is looking at works of art made for the Medici family. There's so much Renaissance art there, hard to pare it down, right? So in order to get through the material, I think looking at the Medici allows us to discuss most of the major issues regarding Renaissance art in Italy in the 15th century. So a Medici work, right? The second Medici work we've seen so far, if we think of the works in San Marco as being from the Medici family, or for the Medici family, right? They were, like I said before, amazing patrons of the arts. And it was the Medici family that was behind this, which was, I think, on your worksheet, Donatello's David. The first freestanding, life-sized sculpture since ancient Rome. So over 1,000 years had gone by since anyone had made a freestanding, life-sized statue. And by freestanding, I mean not up against a building, right? You could say, well, what about the Moses well? Well, it's not freestanding, right? It's on that structure. This was meant to be seen in the round. Right? And so it's reviving very much an ancient tradition, freestanding sculpture, and also an ancient technique, which is bronze casting, which we'll talk about. Right? No one had been doing life-size bronzes either, ever since ancient Rome. So what Donatello is doing is he's really rivaling the best that there ever was. And making us very aware that this is the Renaissance, this is the rebirth of things that had been done in ancient Rome and had not been done since. Right? Now, when the Medici commissioned this from Donatello, the site that they're going to erect it in, it's not there anymore, it's in a museum, was right in the middle of the courtyard of the Medici Palace. So as you come in off the street, before you move your way into the different rooms of the Medici Palace, you come into this courtyard, and about where that drain hole is there is where David would have been originally, greeting anyone who came in off of the street. Now this becomes a fascinating thing because, remember what did the Florentines think about David? Remember this from your worksheet? What did the Florentines think about David?
It was like a shield, like he represented the giants. How he fought against them.
Right. They really thought he was he is our role model, right? Not a patron saint per se, because he's Old Testament, right? But yeah, he's really important to the Florentines because he's the giant killer. And they were always fighting more powerful enemies and winning again and again and again. And they started thinking like, we are the Davids of Renaissance Europe, right? Renaissance Italy. So he is a symbol for them of, who they are, their character, right? And we find that in numerous occasions, David is really important to Florentines, right? And there are a lot of people want things with David on them specifically for that reason. Medici no different, right? But what's interesting is standing inside of their palace, there was a law in Florence that said you couldn't put up public monuments to individuals in the street, right? That was against the law because they were representative government. We're not about the individual, we're about the community. Okay? So the Medici goes inside their palace, and when anybody came in off the street, any visitors would automatically, they would see David. And they would think, Florence, right? And this becomes an analogy for exactly how the Medici are ruling the city, which is kind of behind the scenes, right? They're getting their puppets elected to government, doing everything that they tell them to, right? And they're kind of hiding this idea that they're saying, we are Florence. You guys may not think this, but who's really Florence? Medici family, right? So when you came through, that became this sort of propaganda. David is the Medici family as well, right? By displaying it right there. Now, bronze casting, something we don't do around here because we don't have the facilities. The way that you cast bronze is you start off with, in A, right? You sort of build the matrix of the form, okay? So you get the pose and whatnot. You cover that with a soft material. And the easiest way to do this is to cover it with wax, right? And then you cover the wax that you've then shaped to be exactly what you want it to look like, all the details and whatnot. Right? You could do it with clay as well. Not as easy, but you could do it with clay. Cover with wax, that's B, right? And then you cover the wax with plaster, with a series of pinholes that will connect the plaster outside the wax to the matrix inside. And then you heat it up in D, and all the wax runs out. Right? So now what you've got is the outside casing, the inside, and the space between the two. At that point, you pour in the bronze. Right? That fills the space where the wax used to be. Right? And then you crack it open. Right? And you get rid of the stuff that was on the inside. Does that all make sense? They call it lost wax, bronze casting. And that's how this is made. So he's hollow. And almost every bronze statue you see, unless it's like this big, right, are hollow because if they were solid, they would obviously weigh, 70 times as much. And they already weigh tons. Right? So it's an economical way of casting. And it's something that the Romans were very good at. The Greeks were very good at in ancient times. The art wasn't entirely lost, but it had only been practiced for things like church doors, right? Small-scale statues, right? Hadn't been practiced as often in the Middle Ages, and partly because the Middle Ages thought the human body was, there's that pesky second commandment. You know your 10 Commandments? Second one says, you shall make no graven images, which means carved images. And for Christians, well, what does that mean? Right? I can't make carved images, especially not images of man, because that's what God did. Right? So the idea was sort of seen in the Middle Ages as being somewhat blasphemous. Well, here's Donatello returning to this, right? Returning to ancient techniques, returning to the human form, and returning to I lost my train of thought. Right? Certainly, he's returning to contrapposto, right? You can see the pose is that same counterbalanced pose, or at least the derivation of it, that we saw Masaccio using in the Tribute Money, where it's based on actually studying ancient art, where One leg is flexed, one leg is relaxed. One arm is flexed, bent, the other arm is relaxed. And you'll notice that as we look at it, and especially in Polyclitus, which was used to teach ancient Greek artists how to do the human pose, that the flexed leg is on the same side as the relaxed arm. And the flexed arm is on the same side as the relaxed leg. And the head turns one way, but the body turns the other. Right? Head turns toward your left, the body opens toward your right. And Donatello's been looking at this and sort of adapts it into the image of David. So again, this is that second phase, right, of the Renaissance. The first phase being just realism, naturalism, chiaroscuro. The second phase being Roman bodies are now being used for Christian images, right? Now, what Donatello wants us to look at with this is David as a teenager. David as the boy king, who not through his power, but through the power of God, is able to defeat Goliath. Right? It's not anything that David himself did, like Cosmas and Damian. Right? It's only through the power of God that he can do this. So how does Donatello show that? Nude, right? He's not armored up for battle. He is vulnerable. So he needs God. Right? Prepubescent soft musculature. Right? He's not buff like the guy on the right. Right? He's not built. He's not toned. Cut. Choose your adjective. Right? He's developing still. He's soft. And in fact, even though this is made out of metal, there's a softness to it, right? He's got moobs, man boobs, right? And he's got, it doesn't have a six-pack per se, but there's a sense of it being pliable and soft. And that's the theme that Donatello works through the entire sculpture, this idea that David is this vulnerable, soft youth who needs the help of God in order to defeat Goliath. And he gets there in a number of different ways. He does art history, if you will. He goes out looking for other Greek sculptures where he can find people that were interested in sort of sensuous flesh. And Praxiteles was known in the Renaissance as being the one sculptor who could actually sculpt marble to look like flesh. Right? They're still muscled, but you can see that the transitions between the muscles are significantly softer. Right? He's achieving what Donatello achieves later, which is that sense of plasticity, even though it's hard and cold. It doesn't look that way to the eye. So by studying a range of Greek sculptures, Roman copies of Greek sculptures, Donatello is able to come up with an ideal form for the youthful David. And you notice that even in the Praxiteles, we have variations on the contrapposto pose still. And everywhere we look, it's soft. Nice from the back, right? Everything is emphasizing the softness of David, the youthful, underdeveloped softness. And here's an uncomfortable slide. You can see, looking on the front, he's standing on Goliath's head. See that? Right, that's the head of Goliath underneath. So we have an exact moment in the story. He's knocked Goliath down with a sling, and he's gone and cut off his head. And now he's posing on top of the trophy, right? Ha ha, look what I've done, right? But the face is sort of, doesn't really have that cockiness to it, right? But you can see he's got his sword that he used to cut off the head, and he's got his foot resting right on Goliath's head, right? We see this from the back as well. And on the helmet that Goliath is wearing, there's this feather. And it goes all the way up there, right? It makes my voice just break thinking about it, right? Tickling the inner thigh of David, right? Now, why is Donatello doing this? Is this just fetishism? Probably not. He's probably using that as another way of suggesting that what he wants us to think about is the softness of the flesh. Right? To actually think about touch as we look at it. And as we think about touch, think about how unformed, how unathletic, how unready for the task David is at this point. Right? The youth who slew the giant. And with that, there are other things that we can look at in the way of maybe less uncomfortable details, although uncomfortable in different ways. The face of David seems kind of aloof. Right? And the foot is icky, right? Look at what you're looking at there. He's got his foot right on the bloody stump. And look what he's done is he's wrapped the beard of Goliath, which has got to be just caked with blood. Yeah, I know, right? And he's wrapped it through his toe, and he's sort of playing with it, right? And he seems so unaffected by the violence of the scene. And that's the other thing that makes him this kid, right? It's the kid who, like, tortures, animals or something like that. It doesn't really think about what they're doing. It's just, they're sort of, they don't have any sense yet of the impact of what's happening, right? So, all of this is to point to Donatello really pulling out the stops here, right? Working with this idea of David as this youthful king who defeats the greater enemies. That would have been resonant to the Florentines, but doing it in a very particular way, which is to work with the body of David, based on classical examples, very well studied ones, right? That emphasize his inability to physically do this. He needs God working through him to make this work. Let's see, we'll wrap up 15th century on, what is today? It's Thursday, Friday. The other thing is that your next worksheet 5, will probably come due next week, early next week, like Monday or Tuesday. So you want to get started working on it, I'll update that this afternoon and send an email to everybody for when that's due. But it won't be due this week, so you got a little bit of leeway time. I plan to get your grading done by the end of the weekend. I've got other things this week that kind of get in the way. I've got Saturday morning, so that's why I'm not making your worksheet due, because there's no way I'm grading it and your bibliographies over the weekend, right? So I will get those back to you as soon as I can. Okay?